Let's rock.
Duke Nukem 3D is one of the best first-person shooters of all time. It took what Doom did before it and made something truly unique. It was fast, frenetic, over the top, and best of all, totally badass. Join me as we take a look at some early development footage of Duke Nukem 3D. We'll have a brief look at the earliest known builds, and then we'll look at the prototype known as Lameduke. Here we're seeing an early demo of the build engine, which is the name of the game engine that Duke 3D would be developed on. Development on Duke would start sometime in 1994, but some people may even consider this build demo to be some kind of prototype for Duke 3D, as this level is said to be in the files of Lameduke, under Episode 1 Level 9. The level isn't actually accessible on normal play though, as it uses an older version of the level file format. As can be expected, it's quite basic at this point. It's almost hard to believe that this engine is powering Duke 3D, as it has such a different tone and feel. The engine would eventually be finalised and give us some great games such as Blood, Shadow Warrior, and of course Duke Nukem 3D. It offered a great level of interactivity not often seen in games at the time. The engine would also be revived again much later on, in 2019, with Ion Fury, the first commercial game to be released on the engine in 20 years. What we're seeing now is the earliest known prototype of Duke 3D. This footage was released by 3D Realms in 2014. It's said that this prototype is from mid-1994, so not long after the build engine demo. It's a very short clip, but even here you can see some familiar things such as the CCTV surveillance cameras. The most notable differences here being a totally unrecognisable weapon, completely different heads-up display, and well, basically everything is visually different to what would eventually be. Also of note is how the game is stylized of Duke 3D at the time as opposed to the Duke 3D we got in the final. Before we continue, I must say it's pretty hard to get this thing running on a modern system, so please excuse the footage. Anyway, let's take a look. It was released by 3D Realms as a one-year celebration of the original shareware release. It shouldn't take long to work out why they decided to call this build Lameduke. It clearly needed some more time in the oven. That said, even at this early point, you can tell a lot of love has been put into this. With the build date of the 30th of December 1994, it's much more recognisable as Duke Nukem 3D. That said, almost everything in this build is different from the final game, including having different enemies, weapons, levels, and items. 2 levels from this prototype would survive until the retail build. E3L2, which is Derelict from the Atomic Edition, and E3L8, Overlord. Today I want to focus on the weapons and enemies featured in the game, and maybe look at the levels in more depth in a later video. The weapons in Lameduke were very different. Some of them would end up being used, some would end up being modified, and some would end up being scrapped or replaced. Let's have a look at these weapons in this early version. Also, I don't know where else to mention this, so I'm going to mention it here before we begin. If you press C, it will make Duke crack his knuckles. Weird. Was there going to be some sort of taunt in this game? Duke does a similar animation in the final game, but it can't be done on command like it can here in Lameduke. Anyway, let's get started by looking at this game's version of the pistol. The pistol functions largely the same as it does in the final, as far as I can tell. Although one thing to note is that picking up ammo will give the player more bullets than it does in the final game. I think the most interesting difference here is that it has a working laser pointer. It's a shame the laser sight was dropped, as it's pretty cool. Here's a look at the prototype pistol on the left and the final version on the right. As you can see, the early version is lighter in tone, and it would end up having a very slight redesign, but they look mostly identical. Originally, Duke was going to use a taser weapon as his close range attack. What I find interesting about this is that it uses batteries as ammunition. The batteries could also be used to power the plasma rifle. When you have ammo, Duke holds out the taser and it electrocutes whatever it touches, but when you're out of ammo, he will just whack his enemies. This weapon would later be scrapped in favour of the mighty foot. Another scrapped or reworked weapon is the plasma rifle. It's a powerful weapon that shares the same ammo as the taser. Looking at the plasma rifle, it's clear that, while cut, the sprite was reworked into the Ripper. An interesting thing to note is that Duke has a barcode on his left hand. This was removed in the final game. Perhaps one of my favourite weapons in Duke, the pipe bomb, also appears in this prototype. It isn't too different here from the final, but I think it's worth mentioning that you can't hold the bomb down with the fire button in a ready state. The bomb throws the moment you press the button. Also, it is a bit glitchy and it's able to pass through solid objects. The last weapon we'll be looking at is the RPG. Duke holds it with a grip instead of the bar that we see in the final. One interesting thing about the RPG is that you have to ready the weapon before it can be fired. Also, rockets will fire through as many enemies as they hit until they make contact with the wall. Lameduke has a completely different cast of enemies when compared to the final game. It's definitely weird playing Duke Nukem 3D with no pig cops or assault troopers. It seems like the theme was more centred around android or cyborg enemies in this build, and it gives it a completely different feel. I've decided to split this section into familiar enemies and scrapped enemies. While I think all of the enemies are interesting to check out, there's not always a lot to say about some of them. With that said, let's take a look. As I'm sure you're aware, the sharks made their way into the final product. They look a bit different here, but you'd be forgiven for not noticing. They lack some detail, and their AI is quite simple too. The turrets in Lameduke use a completely different design. It's said that they use plasma projectiles, but I can't seem to tell. Honestly, I can't tell if their attacks are even hitting the player. They raise up from the ground on pedestals when you get close to them. While the Protozoid Slimer did make it into the final game, it looks completely different. It has a different shape altogether, and also has a different set of teeth. It behaves very similarly to how it does in the final, but for some reason cannot be killed with anything but the plasma gun. There's no Protozoid Slimer eggs yet, and I don't think they have the ability to absorb other enemies yet either. These scrapped enemies were, judging by their names, meant to be robots that look like humans. The Femandroid has a mohawk similar to the pig cops in the final game. The Mandroid wears a white top and camo trousers. The Mandroids don't seem to have any AI yet, and they won't take any damage either. Drone 1 is a flying robot that flies towards the player, similar to how the sentry drone works in the final game. However, these enemies don't explode when they get near Duke, they instead fire bullets. Drone 2's only appearance in the game is on the title screen. Here we can see the jellyfish enemy that would eventually be reworked into the Octobrain. It has a much darker appearance and seems to be more mechanical in nature. If we look at its concept art, it shows that it was intended to have an alternate attack where it would trap a human in its tentacles and then would electrify to make the person shoot the player. Would the person be dead? Likely. Pretty creepy if you ask me. It would also use the ship as camouflage to presumably hide from Duke. I'm not sure if this guy's meant to be a robot or not, as when you kill him, he bleeds. These guys are armed with a pistol weapon. It's speculated that the trooper ended up becoming the assault trooper, as they have similar behaviours. Both enemies use jetpacks too, but in slightly different ways. The trooper will only use his jetpack when Duke activates his, but the assault troopers will use their jetpack whenever they feel like it. The captain is a metallic humanoid enemy with a radiation symbol on his back. He's a bit tougher to kill when compared to the trooper. He has the plasma projectile as a weapon, but ultimately isn't too difficult to take down. So there you have it. Have you ever played this prototype? Which is your favourite scrapped enemy? Please feel free to leave a comment and let me know. I hope you enjoyed taking a look at this early version of Duke 3D with me. There's still a lot to look at in this game, and I might end up showing off some of the levels eventually. Thanks for sticking around. See you in the next video.